A chuoine úsle agus Joe Hassett, tá fáte romh go léir hig leirlin náisiúnta na hÉireann. You are all so welcome to the National Library of Ireland and our historic reading room this evening for the annual Joseph Hassett lecture to mark the birth date of W.B. Yeats, which obviously was the 13th of June 1865. And to thank everybody most sincerely for being here. It's a wonderful turnout, and I just want to acknowledge the presence here in the room, which is a full house, but also to acknowledge the hundreds of people online from around the world joining us this evening, and to thank them most sincerely for their presence here as well virtually. The National Library of Ireland's annual Joseph Hassett Yeats lecture marks the birthday of W.B. Yeats on the 13th of June 1865. First delivered back in 2013, the Yeats Birthday Lecture Series was inspired by the National Library of Ireland's long-running exhibition on the life and works of William Butler Yeats downstairs, which showcases the preeminent collection of Yeats material in the world and is generously supported by Joseph Hassett. Mr. Joseph Hassett, a leading trial lawyer, literary scholar, author and philanthropist, is also a much valued friend of the National Library of Ireland, and it is our great pleasure and privilege to celebrate over a decade together with this treasured annual collaboration in terms of lecture series to mark the birth date of W.B. Yeats. Each year, Joe invites a distinguished speaker to reflect on an aspect of W.B. Yeats's rich life and work, and previous speakers have included poets Paula Meehan and Theo Dorgan, John McCourt and Professor Geraldine Higgins, some of whom are in the room this evening as I speak. This evening's lecture, which marks the 100th anniversary of Yeats receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature, is entitled Ireland's Interpreter and Europe's Welcome, W.B. Yeats and the Nobel Prize in Literature 1923. It is an incredible honour as well to introduce our speaker to mark the Joseph Hassett Lecture Series and lecture here in commemoration of W.B. Yeats, and it's Professor Margaret Kelleher. Professor Kelleher is Chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at University College Dublin and a great friend also of the National Library of Ireland. She was a Fellow at the Cullman Centre in New York Public Library from September 2022 to May of 2023, so just last month, working on a biography of Mary and Porrick Cullum. Margaret was the academic lead for University College Dublin in the creation of the Museum of Literature Ireland, a collaboration between UCD and the National Library of Ireland, and is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Margaret Kelleher has published widely in the fields of Irish literature and Irish cultural history, and her 2018 book, The Mamtrasna Murders, Language, Life and Death in 19th Century Ireland, was awarded the American Conference of Irish Studies Prize for Books on Irish Language and Culture. So it is my great honour and privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Margaret Kelleher.
Thank you, Audrey, for the warm words of welcome, and my thanks also to Breed O'Sullivan, Liz Coffey and colleagues for making this evening possible. It's very moving to be in this room. I've worked here for many decades, ever since I was a postgraduate student, and the resources of this library and the help of the staff have been central to every single thing I've published. So I'm delighted to be here on this historic literary birthday and an event made possible by my dear friend and UCD alum, Dr. Joe Hassett. So to begin, in early November 1923, Yeats received a call from a journalist who reported that either he or Thomas Mann were expected to win the Nobel Prize in Literature that year. Some 8 days later, and I'm quoting now from Yeats's own recollections, between 10 and 11 at night comes a telephone message from the Irish Times saying that the prize has indeed been conferred upon me. And some 10 minutes after that comes a telegram from the Swedish ambassador. Then journalists come for interviews. At 12:30, my wife and I are alone and search the cellar for a bottle of wine, but it's empty, and as a celebration is necessary, we cook sausages. A couple of days pass and a letter from the ambassador invites me to receive the prize at Stockholm, but a letter from the Swedish Academy offers to send medal, money and diploma to Dublin. These famous lines come from Yeats's autobiographical essay, The Bounty of Sweden, published in the journals The Dial and London Mercury in September 1924, and subsequently by Kula Press in a limited run of 400 copies. The essay derives from a journal which Yeats kept during his visit to Stockholm in December 1923. He did choose to travel to receive his award. Included in this imprint and in subsequent editions of his autobiographies is the text of his Nobel lecture called The Irish Dramatic Movement, as remembered and written up by Yeats on his return to Ireland. These are very valuable and much cited sources, but this evening I'd like, in this anniversary year, to share with you some less well-known sources to explore behind the scenes of the Nobel Award. I'll discuss what can be known as to how the nomination process operated, and as we'll see in the case of Yeats in 1923, that's a surprising amount. Why Yeats was the chosen awardee, and how the award was received, both nationally and internationally. But firstly, to set the context of the Nobel Prize. The prize in literature is one of 5 ordained by Alfred Nobel in his third and last will, signed in November 1895, where he bequeathed the bulk of his estate, well over 90% of his estate, to fund 5 prizes. The prizes, in his words, are to be awarded, quote, to those who, during the preceding year, have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. And the will continues. The interest is to be divided into 5 equal parts and distributed as follows. 1 part to the person who made the most important discovery or invention in the field of physics. 1 part to the person who made the most important chemical discovery or improvement. 1 part to the person who made the most important discovery within the domain of physiology or medicine. 1 part to the person who in the field of literature produced the most outstanding work in an idealistic direction. And 1 part to the person who has done the most or best to advance fellowship among nations, the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and the establishment and promotion of peace congresses. A 6th prize in economics was established as a memorial prize in 1968. Nobel also stipulated by whom the award should be made. 4 out of 5 awards are made by Swedish bodies, for instance, in the case of literature, by the Academy in Stockholm. And he specified that the prize for peace should be chosen by a committee of 5 persons, in turn selected by the Norwegian Parliament. He concluded with the following clause: "It is my express wish that when awarding the prizes, no consideration be given to nationality, but that the prize be awarded to the worthiest person, whether or not they are Scandinavian." Along with the establishment of these prizes, Nobel is of course best remembered for the invention of dynamite, which he patented in 1867. Son of a largely unsuccessful father who was twice bankrupt, Nobel received very little formal education, but even as a young man was a formidable linguist as well as chemist, and he was also an occasional poet and dramatist, for example, an especially ardent fan of the poetry of Shelley. Towards the end of his life, he began work on a satirical comedy and published a dramatic tragedy. The source of his fortune has continued to be controversial. James English, in his book on prizes and awards entitled The Economy of Prestige, describes the prize as, quote, gradually laundering his economic fortune and symbolic reputation through a series of cleansing cultural transactions. English also notes that this was the first time that virtually all of an industrialist's fortune was placed in the service of prizes. In this context, it's also worth pointing out that the bulk of Nobel's wealth came during his lifetime from the use of explosives for road building, tunnel building, and mining, rather than military use. And during his lifetime, he had already begun philanthropic activities. He's credited with the following comment: "I'd rather take care of the stomachs of the living than the glory of the departed in the form of monuments." His bequest was more than 31 million Swedish kroner, which at the time of his death converted to over 1.5 million sterling. In 2012, the capital for his bequest was estimated at some 337 million euro. Following his death in 1896 and the opening of his will in January 1897, Nobel's bequest was immediately contested by family members and faced other hurdles, such as the reluctance by some of the bodies he had named to accept the responsibility given. 2 members of the Swedish Academy strongly opposed accepting the task for fear it would take away from the Academy's existing operations and turn it into, quote, "a cosmopolitan tribunal of literature," which does seem what Nobel had in mind. The settlement took 4 years to complete, and during this time, a foundation was created with statutes which ordained that each award would receive its own committee and institute. And I want to spend a couple of moments on these statutes. They state that candidates must be nominated in writing by those entitled to do so before the 1st of February each year. They also specify a number of nomination bodies, not just members of the Swedish Academy, but also other academies, institutions, societies similar in constitution and purpose, and also university teachers of aesthetics, literature, and history. An amendment in 1949 specified further that the category of teachers who could nominate were, quote, "professors of literature and philology at universities and university colleges." And that year, the right to nominate was also extended to previous prize winners and to presidents of societies of authors that are representative of the literary production in their respective countries. An important qualification is worth noting here. It is an individual belonging to these organizations, academies, authors, organizations, and so forth, rather than the organization that has the right to propose. And the current practice is quite clearly outlined in the Nobel website. The committee invites nominations from hundreds of individuals and organizations qualified to nominate. Others who are qualified to nominate but have not received invitations may also submit nominations. The committee receives and processes nominations and produces a shorter list of 5 candidates whose work is read by the members of the Academy and from whom the choice is made, and a candidate must receive more than half of the votes cast. Returning to the text of the will I read earlier, we can see that important stipulations apply, some for all 5 of the prizes and 2 specifically for the prize in literature. For example, the will says, "Those who during the preceding year shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind." The Foundation quickly decided to interpret that clause, "during the preceding year," to mean that the awardee should be alive at the moment of nomination and have work of current interest. And the statutes also ordain that older works may be considered if their significance has only become apparent recently. The 2 specific criteria for the literary prize have proven much more difficult to manage. To read them again, the person who, in the field of literature, has produced the most outstanding work in an idealistic direction. Firstly, should work refer to the work of her career or an individual work? The Academy has usually chosen candidates based on their life's work, though there are exceptions. For example, the citation for Thomas Mann, recipient in 1929, was, quote, "principally for his great novel, Buddenbrooks." John Galsworthy's prize in 1932 was for the Forsyte Saga, as another example. And secondly, as histories of the prize have shown, the phrase "in an idealistic direction" has proven very troublesome. not least because the term is variously translated from Nobel's will as in an idealistic direction, in an ideal direction, or of an idealistic tendency. Members of the Academy have said on record that the term has produced, quote, constant anxiety, unquote. The late Kjell Esmark, former chair of the Nobel Committee in Literature and author of a book on the Nobel Prize in Literature published in 1991, has remarked, "The history of the Literature Prize appears as a series of attempts to interpret an imprecisely worded will." The vexed word was in fact an amendment made by Nobel in his handwritten will. He seems to have initially intended a word close to the English term idealized, and then amended it to a word that can be understood as ideal or idealistic. In the early years of the prize, the controversy about this term raged fiercely, and it does seem that a very narrow interpretation of the term as favouring writing of an uplifting kind seems to have operated. The very first awardee of the prize was Sully Prudhomme, the French essayist and poet, one of the more forgettable awardees. And Leo Tolstoy, who was widely expected to receive the prize, was passed over, leading many Swedish writers at the time to protest publicly. The committee reports for that year record an evaluation of Tolstoy's work as having, quote, ghastly naturalistic descriptions and negative asceticism. In 1903, Ibsen was nominated, one of 3 years in which he was nominated, but instead the prize was awarded to another Norwegian dramatist, Bjornson. In 1907, Rudyard Kipling won over his fellow Englishmen George Meredith and Swinburne, neither of whom ever won the prize despite being nominated many years. A fascinating complication arose in these early years when a friend of Nobel's claimed that he had instead intended idealism to mean a skeptical and satirical attitude to the social order. And this was supported by others who cited Nobel's dramatic works as examples and his known anti-religious beliefs. This, however, remained a minority view. In 1921, members of the committee suggested an interpretation of the will as meaning something like wide-hearted humanity, a catch-all term which allowed a greater range of writers to succeed. But as we'll see, the term continued to be divisive into the 1920s. Ibsen never won the Nobel Prize in Literature and is one of a long list of famous non-winners, which includes Tolstoy, nominated every year between 1902 and 1906, Emile Zola, who was nominated twice, Joseph Conrad, never nominated, Kafka, never nominated, Thomas Hardy with 25 nominations in 12 different years, Virginia Woolf, never nominated, and most famously for this audience, James Joyce, never nominated. You may wonder how we can know about Ibsen's nomination in 1903, for example, or the non-nominations of others. The historians I've mentioned draw on an archive of annual reports which the committee presented to the Academy, but there's a much more publicly accessible resource. In the Nobel Prize website, nobelprize.org, under the nomination tab, one can access a nomination archive searchable under prize and persons, and can find out who was nominated and by whom for every year up to 1971. There's a secrecy rule of 50, in this case 50 plus years. I warmly recommend a visit there. As you can see, I've spent quite a bit of time there, but indeed be ready to spend some more. So turning now to W.B. Yeats, the site yields fascinating information not just about 1923, but the years before that. Yeats was nominated not only in 1923, but 6 other times. In 1922, in 1921, in 1918, in 1915, in 1914, and amazingly, in 1902. So moving in chronological order, his nomination in 1902 was by Irish historian William Lecky, who is listed as correspondent of the French Institute. Lecky had been elected in 1893 to the French Academy of Sciences. In 1914, Yeats was nominated by George N. Plunkett, obviously better known as Count Plunkett MP, and even better known again as father of Joseph Mary Plunkett. And in 1914, Plunkett is listed as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, UK. In 1915 and 1918, Yeats was nominated by Per Hellström, member of the Swedish Academy, and as we'll see, significantly for Yeats, later chair of the Nobel Committee from 1922. In 1921, he was nominated by Erik Axel Karlfeldt, poet and member of the Swedish Academy, and 10 years later, in 1931, himself the winner of the prize in literature. And for 1922 and 1923, the nomination archive lists Yeats' nominators as the Nobel Committee, a detail to which we'll return. It's clear from the histories of the committee that Yeats was a very close contender in 1922, though he lost to the Spanish dramatist Jacinto Benavente, whose award, according to his citation, was, quote, for the happy manner in which he has continued the illustrious traditions of the Spanish drama. Both Yeats and Benavente were nominated by committee members rather than an individual external to the committee, which suggests to me not just that the committee wasn't satisfied with the quality of other nominations, but also that its members were divided. Epsmark records that the two writers, according to the committee reports, were found to be of comparable stature in literary worth, and that Benavente was ultimately preferred on what Epsmark calls pragmatic grounds, and what, by that he explains, to achieve a greater geographical distribution of the prize, and through a deliberate decision to honour a writer whose work was less familiar and even less immediately appealing. The committee records explored by Epsmark support this. They record that this was, quote, a difficult choice, and also note a deep concern for the committee that I think influenced them for many years, that a prize, in their words, that was intended for the richly varied literature of the whole world was in danger of being limited to a less universal circle. So Yeats, with what the committee termed his exceptionally highly developed English poetic culture, was therefore, in the words of the committee report, more likely to master our emotions, to delight the lyric sense, than Benavente's work, which was more foreign, both in style and subject. So therefore, in a somewhat admirable perversity, work which was less immediately accessible or appealing was to be given the prize. All changed a year later. Yeats was again nominated by a committee member along with 19 others, including the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, and most famously or infamously Thomas Hardy, who received 3 nominations that year, one from Romain Rolland, the Nobel, the French writer and himself a Nobel winner in 1915, and the others a Swedish and Finnish professor. Again, the reports document a divided committee in 1923. A few members, including Karlfeldt, who had nominated Yeats in 1921, preferred Hardy as a candidate, as did the committee member Anders Esterling. Esterling went on to become the official historian of the Nobel Literary Prize, And it's quite remarkable that in his account, a formal account endorsed by the Foundation and published in 1962, he directly acknowledges that he had been an active supporter of Hardy, but that other members of the committee felt, and this is Osterling's words, that Hardy's deep pessimism and inexorable fatalism were not to be reconciled with the spirit of the Nobel Prize. So the controversy continues. Esterling, writing in 1962, takes care to declare that in retrospect and repentance, that Yeats was, quote, one of the happiest selections during the whole period. And it certainly seems that Hellstrom, whom I mentioned earlier, and who is now chair of the Nobel Committee, having previously nominated Yeats, was an influential supporter. And I would also speculate that political events served usefully and curiously to make Yeats more foreign as a candidate. To explain what I mean, if in summer 1922, as a writer working in the English poetic tradition, Yeats was not sufficiently different to satisfy the Nobel concern for diversity, by summer 1923, wider international knowledge and recognition of the Irish Free State, formally established in December 1922, made more visible his role in giving expression to, quote, the spirit of a whole nation, unquote. There's a nice reversal here for those of us who are literary historians and who rightly emphasize the role culture played in the creation of an Irish state. Here, political independence served to bolster the cultural recognition of Irish literature as a distinct tradition internationally. So to continue with Yeats, as I mentioned in my opening, rumours had circulated from early November in 1923. On the 3rd of November, for example, the Irish Times ran an article entitled "Nobel Prize for Literature may be awarded to Mr. W.B. Yeats," and quoted from the Stockholm Times, which had reported that Yeats was expected to be awarded the prize, but that Thomas Mann was also a possible winner. Yeats was interviewed by the Irish Times and commented, quote, "The German Hermann is not one to be despised," and more disarmingly relayed a story in the interview that following the award of the Nobel Prize to Tagore in 1913, a rumour had circulated that Yeats, who had written an introduction to the English edition of Tagore's poems, had played a part, leading to a number of letters from other Indian writers. And the article in the Irish Times said, "That," said Mr. Yeats with a chuckle, "was the nearest approach in my career to winning the Nobel Prize." Now, Yeats's chuckle may have had a number of sources. He was aware that his name had been sent to Sweden previously, but I think most likely not aware of the volume of earlier nominations. And his understanding of the operations of the Nobel Prize was far from accurate. On a number of occasions, including at the beginning of his Nobel lecture, he commented on the English committees who sent you my name. As we've seen, they hadn't. And he continued to believe that Mann was the other leading contender. Mann was, in fact, first nominated only in 1924 and received the award in 1929. Yeats's misunderstanding, which was a general shared one, not particular to Yeats, of how the system worked, led him to propose, not without controversy, in a note to the Kula Press edition of The Bounty of Sweden that since, quote, "no man can receive a Nobel Prize unless his name has been sent to the Swedish Academy by the committees of the country whose citizen he is, now that there is a separate Irish citizenship, there should perhaps be separate Irish committees." But other aspects of Yeats's response as to why he thought he was successful were more persuasive, and the following comment, as Roy Foster has noted, was consistent. "I consider that this honour has come to me less as an individual than as a representative of Irish literature. It is part of Europe's welcome to the Free State." A gesture in part to Ireland's admission to the League of Nations just 2 months before in September. Financially, the award was very welcome indeed. I think you all know that perhaps the most famous anecdote about Yeats's winning the prize is that circulated by Smiley, Irish Times editor, who claimed that Yeats's reaction was, "How much, Smiley? How much is it?" The amount was in the region of £7,000. His initial plan was to invest £6,000 of it and to use some of the remainder to pay off the debt in Merrion Square, and also to use some towards the medical expenses for Lily Yeats, who was then seriously ill with a tubercular lung and in a London nursing home. Almost £400 was spent on the trip to Sweden and completing the furnishings for Merrion Square, including for WB the purchase of a longed-for reference library, including, as he lovingly detailed, the Encyclopaedia Britannica, a good edition of Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and other history books. Ultimately, a considerable part of that £6,000 would go towards paying off Cooler Press's overdraft, £2,000 in 1923, and later in 1931, a further £1,000 was taken out of the investment by WB and George to cover more of the Cooler expenses. As I mentioned, his journey to Sweden is detailed in The Bounty of Sweden, I think known to many in this audience, and I'd recommend it to those who haven't read it as an enjoyable, if rambling, read. I love the review by Susan Mitchell in The Irish Statesman, who was reviewing the Cooler Press imprint and described it as, quote, gossip, distinguished gossip, stamped with the elaborate pattern of Mr. Yeats's style. It contains a wonderful account of his worry about observing royal protocol of walking backward, having received the diploma and medal, but crucially walking backwards while ascending 6 steps back to the elevated platform. His account is one with which it's easy to empathize. As I am about to step sideways like the others, I notice that the carpet is not nailed down, and this suddenly concentrates my attention upon the parallel lines made by the 2 edges of the carpet, and as though I were hypnotized, I feel that I must move between them, and so straight up backward without any sidelong movement. It seems to me that I am a long time reaching the top, and as the cheering grows much louder when I get there, I must have roused the sympathy of the audience. He also recalls being able to examine with some relief his medal and its design. The medal, of course, designed in 1902 by Eric Lindbergh, has an image of Alfred Nobel on the front, and on the back, a young man sitting under a laurel tree, listening to and writing down the Song of the Muse. The inscription from Book 6 of the Aeneid translates as, "Inventions enhance life, which is beautified through art." It's clear from his recollections that Yeats was deeply smitten by the royal family. There are moments in the account he lightheartedly describes them as looking like stage royalties, as in a dramatized version of The Prisoner of Zenda, and the analogy is Yeats's. But later his account becomes more serious and very invested, with a disapproving account of his fellow awardee, A.V. Hill, whom Yeats described as, quote, also moved by the spectacle of the court, but to a Jacobin frenzy. Hill was the recipient for physiology and medicine, and there's an interesting twist in his award, that prize for physiology and medicine hadn't been awarded in 1922. The statutes allow in such a case that the prize can be reserved for the following year, and as a result, 2 prizes were awarded in 1923. I mention that also partly because a similar occurrence happened in 1925, so that George Bernard Shaw, while the winner of the 1925 award received his in 1926, famously deliberated for some time whether or not he would accept it and received it in absentia. And another twist of Nobel history is that the Peace Prize wasn't awarded in 1923, Yeats's year, which again I think is striking, given what was happening in world events. To continue for a few moments with the ceremony itself, the medals and diplomas were presented in an afternoon ceremony, and then that evening at a banquet, Halmström, whom I've mentioned earlier, gave a presentation speech to Yeats. Then Yeats, a number of days later, on the 15th of December, gave his official lecture to the Swedish Royal Academy. That lecture on the Irish dramatic movement is very well known, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But the text of the presentation speech by Hellström is much less well known, though it's available in full from the Nobel website, and warmly recommend a read. To remind you first of the short citation, the citation for the prize famously reads, "For his always inspired poetry, which in a highly artistic form gives expression to the spirit of a whole nation." But there are all sorts of interesting, I think, interrelationships between literature and politics also happening in Hellström's speech. For example, Hellström took care to introduce Yeats as educated for the most part in England, which he described as Yeats's second fatherland, and went on to characterize his work as a form of political reconciliation, describing how Yeats had, in his words, achieved through the world of the poetic imagination a blending together of Celtic and English which had never been successfully effected in the political sphere. And as the leader of what Hellström called the mighty movement of the Celtic revival, he described Yeats as having created a new national literature, an Anglo-Irish literature, but the creation of a new nation state is, I think, quite interestingly, not mentioned. One other detail that's interesting about that presentation is that it was largely concerned with Yeats's drama, not his lyric poems. And as a result, I think the fact that it's commented quite often by Yeats biographers about the so-called surprising focus by Yeats on drama in his own speech is, I think, less surprising feature than others may have suggested. Hellström also squarely, and I think to Yeats's likely pleasure, identified the difficulty of the Irish writer's work. When this art reaches its highest level, it is absolutely magical, but it is seldom easy to grasp. It is indeed often so obscure that an effort is needed to understand it. And only in the closing lines does Hellström specifically mention the poetry or gesture to recent political events. He refers to Yeats following the spirit that early appointed him the interpreter of his country, a country that had long waited for someone to bestow on it a voice. I mean, we could debate for a long time the assumptions that are operating here. In his acceptance speech that evening, Yeats expressed his gratitude to the Scandinavian nation. He described his debt to Swedenborg, whose work he had first encountered through the work of Yeats. And he also mentioned the significance for Irish theatre of the theatre of Ibsen and Björnson. Accounts of the speech differ as to whether Yeats said Björnson or Strindberg. Newspaper accounts cited Strindberg. The published text gives Björnson. And the inclusion of Ibsen led one disgruntled Swedish journalist to wonder if Yeats had forgotten he was in Sweden. Famously, some days later, the Irish dramatic movement was the theme of his lecture. And therefore, I think it's all the more interesting, given what I just mentioned about Hellström's speech, that from the beginning, Yeats unhesitatingly names the political background to his work and names recent events. The modern literature of Ireland, and indeed all that stir of thought which prepared for the Anglo-Irish War, began when Parnell fell from power in 1891. Many times during his lecture, he recounts the challenges facing the theatre movement, including those from Dublin Castle. In Yeats's words, "We were from the first a recognised public danger." He claims with pride the continuing political influence of the movement, again to quote from Yeats, Indeed, the young ministers and party politicians of the Free State have had, I think, some of their education from our plays. And he also strategically emphasises the theatre's precarity. We are burdened with debt, for we have come through war and civil war, and audiences grow thin when there is firing in the street. In other words, his audience in Stockholm is left in no doubt whatsoever as to the rawness of current Irish politics. In crediting the importance of Augusta Gregory, Yeats reports, "Her own house has been protected by her presence, but the house where she was born was burned down by incendiaries some few months ago, and there has been like disorder over the greater part of Ireland." And he continues, "If in their war with the English auxiliary police, our people were shown no mercy, they showed none. Murder answered murder, yet ignorance and violence can remember the noblest beauty." With respect to the role of Gregory in Synge, the lecture is a generous one and moving. Yeats, again to quote from Yeats, "When I received from the hands of your king the great honour your academy has conferred upon me, I felt that a young man's ghost should have stood upon one side of me, and at the other, a living woman in her vigorous old age." Sections of his speech, such as his long summary, and it is a long summary, of the plot of The Playboy of the Western World, as part of his discussion of the work of Synge, must have bemused his Swedish audience. But others, including Yeats's extravagant compliments to what he called the splendid spectacle of your court, must have been well received. However, the final lines of his lecture, in which he laments the absence of a like spectacle in Ireland with, quote, "its work of discipline and taste," constitute, as Roy Foster has rightly commented, an ominous last sentence which should not be ignored. And the lines convey, and again I'm drawing from Foster here, a natural elitism with significant political implications in the years to follow. To mention, by way of close, very briefly the reception of his award, Yeats received many telegrams of congratulations, including from his theatre colleagues the Fays and also from Porrick and Mary Cullum in New York. The award was the subject of Senate speeches, including from Oliver St. John Gogarty, who presented Yeats' success in very chauvinistic terms and also misunderstood the nominated process. This is Gogarty. "When a detached and impartial nation, and a nation with discrimination such as the highly educated Swedes, have selected Senator Yeats for such an award above and in spite of the recommendation of the Literary Committee of Great Britain, and selected him from a race that hitherto had not been accepted into the Comity of Nations." It's salutary to read in the Senate speeches within Gogarty's pantheon of the great men whom Yeats has joined that the Italian men named by Gogarty are Virgil and Dante, Marconi and Mussolini. In the English press, what was seen as the passing over of Hardy was frequently mentioned. The American press featured a number of complaints as to the absence of any American winners. Sinclair Lewis was the first American to win the award in 1930. The Boston Globe editorial remarked, "Is it possible that the judges haven't seen any of our bestsellers?" And a particular favourite of mine from the American press is the comment in the Brooklyn Eagle in November 1923, whose editor confidently wrote, "William Butler Yeats is no prouder than the New Ireland over his winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Indeed, poetry and fiction were the real basis of the Sinn Féin revolution." Sympathy for Hardy was also expressed by Ernest Hemingway, writing of the Toronto Star, who termed him, quote, "the ghost that must haunt the Nobel Prize givers' consciences." And I think he has a point on that. though he also credited Yeats with having written, in Hemingway's words, with the exception of a few poems by Ezra Pound, the very finest poetry of our time. Pound, on the other hand, writing about the Nobel Prize in spring 1924, offered, I think, what must be one of the largest kind of examples of ouch factor when he caustically dismissed what he termed the spectacle of impoverished England howling over the loss of the only thing literary England can understand, namely a sum of monies. Strikingly, given the history of non-winners, Pound went on to declare that if the award had not gone to Mr. Yeats, it, quote, should have been given to his most distinguished compatriot, the author of Ulysses, who was very probably not recommended by the Irish Committee, unquote, a committee which, as we know, never existed. In the short term, the financial cushion provided by the award for Yeats would diminish. In the longer term, as our gathering tonight testifies, it would prove a huge milestone in his career. In the medium term, it certainly generated wider international, especially European interest in his writings, with many translations of his poems. His work was later cited in a number of other Nobel addresses, for example, in 1948, making his presentation speech to T.S. Eliot, Esterling cited Yeats's award. And in 1963, the Greek poet George Sepphoris began his Nobel lecture by referring to, quote, a poet who is especially dear to me, the Irishman W.B. Yeats, and quoted from The Bounty of Sweden. But to conclude, most powerful of all is the reference to Yeats by Seamus Heaney in his 1995 lecture, Crediting Poetry, an extraordinary lecture, many of whose references, including to the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova and to the unnamed woman in the prison queue in Leningrad, continue to grow in power. Heaney reminds us that Yeats was, in December 1923, the recent author of the great sequences 1919 and Meditations in Time of Civil War. That latter poem, published in the Dial and London Mercury in January 1923, had at the time of the Nobel Award still a limited circulation. But it's impossible in 2023, in this year of many anniversaries, not to link them together, given how close we are this evening to the marking of the end of the Civil War and its violent aftermath. For Heaney, Yeats's poem achieves a precious doubleness of being, to use Heaney's words, tender-minded and tough-minded. To quote again from Heaney, it satisfies the contradictory needs which consciousness experiences at times of extreme crisis. The need, on the one hand, for a truth-telling that will be hard and retributive, and on the other hand, the need not to harden the mind to a point where it denies its own yearnings for sweetness and trust. To conclude, it's both a beautiful and terrible summary of the past century that the following lines have certainly become Ireland's interpreter. We had fed the heart and fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm sure that I speak for everybody here and those watching in expressing our gratitude for your great critical intelligence and articulate speech that lets us be a little bit, I think of Dorothy getting to Oz and looking behind the screen. I think the wizard says this, okay, but this is a highly irregular procedure. But it's so illuminating to have you as our guide through the ins and outs and ups and downs of the Nobel selection process. And it's so revealing. I think of the American Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, I forget on what subject, but he says on this subject, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. And I think this page of history which you've assembled for us lets us see so clearly this moment of the Yeats Nobel as a formal recognition of a distinctive Irish literature, and simultaneously a recognition of that literature as a part of a global literature. And also, you teased out so beautifully the relationship between the founding of an Irish literature, or the recognition of an Irish literature, and the recognition of an Irish nation state. So it's such a rich subject for our meditation, thought, and further thought. It's really been a great gift to all of us, and I express again for everybody our gratitude. Pache Per Hellstrom, who said Yeats was educated mainly in England, we know here that the principal part of his education was in this building. And I think some of it in this room, and then I think he writes that the librarian let him have a little space in the stacks too, where it would be quieter. But in a way, the award of that Nobel is a reminder of the importance of cultural institutions like this one in fostering the growth and development of great contributors of every kind to culture, both the national culture and the world culture. And we're so in need of that today on a global basis that I think we're all feeling fortunate to have this great institution where we are tonight, and doubly fortunate to have your marvelous lecture, Margaret, that illuminates the importance of such institutions. One footnote, we'll all be looking forward to Margaret's joint biography of Porrick and Mary Callum, and with the spirit of Yeats hovering above us in his concentration on the position of the stars as to different people's birth dates, I understand that today is the birth date of Mary Callum, so I think that's a good omen for a great book forthcoming soon from Margaret on the joint lives of Porrick and Mary Callum. Again, thank you, Margaret. It was wonderful.
So I just want to concur, obviously, with Joe Hassett there. Margaret, thank you so much for that incredible lecture, and to thank Joe most sincerely again for his incredible patronage on such an auspicious date as W.B. Yeats' birthday. And also just to mention today we had a very fortuitous announcement from our Minister Catherine Martin here, whereby we're going to go to planning for next door in a matter of weeks in terms of the renovations here, and we're certainly looking at the spirit of the nation as a theme when it comes to the Yeats material, alongside so many other incredible holdings that make up the 12 million items of the National Library of Ireland. And to thank you all most sincerely for your presence, and for your presence online, to say that it's deeply appreciated, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. And to follow, obviously, the incredible scholarly publications of Joe Hassett and Margaret Kelleher, and also all of our events and programmes and collections on nli.ie. So thank you very much indeed.